At 06:47 a.m., in the choke point where the Red Sea narrows to a knife's edge, dawn smeared silver across a restless sea. USS Mason, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, rode the swell one ship length off USNS Supply, both shepherding a nervous ribbon of merchant hulls toward open water. The morning was calm, but it was the kind of calm that makes sailors uneasy. Inside the Combat Information Center, the air was red and heavy with coffee and ozone. Screens blinked, voices murmured, and every word carried weight. On the mast, the SPY-6 radar watched the horizon. Reports indicate it can track large numbers of contacts under favorable conditions, and tonight it felt less like a machine and more like an impatient god. Somewhere above 30,000 feet, an RC-135 Rivet Joint cut a thin white line across the dawn, whispering down encrypted reports. Stray radio signals, unusual movement patterns, hints of something alive in the haze. Beneath the waves, the ship's sonar listened to the ocean's heartbeat. It heard the slow rhythm of propellers, the hum of cables, the tiny fractures of pressure that meant the deep was never truly empty. The destroyer felt alive, breathing, thinking, waiting. The operations plot glowed with dots, tankers, coasters, a rust-scarred freighter dragging 12 knots. Bearings ticked. A petty officer rubbed a lucky coin, muttering a quiet prayer. Under favorable conditions, SPY-6 can paint a target the size of a gull. Under real conditions, gulls sometimes look like threats. Every sweep of the radar's eye was a coin toss between safety and disaster. Then something changed. It wasn't louder, it was tighter. The silence stretched until it snapped. On the northwest edge of the screen, a single speck moved, steady and deliberate. It flared crimson. One blip became 3, then 5, then a rash of tiny wounds spreading toward the convoy. The alert tone hit like a hammer. Letters crawled across the main display in cold white, multiple inbound tracks. No one spoke. No one even breathed. Somewhere, the clock started counting down a life. The first ping, a little red dot, EN. The room was dim, painted in red light and tension. Dozens of green traces crawled across the Combat Information Center's main display, fishing boats, merchant vessels, surface clutter. But in the middle of that ordered chaos, one trace moved differently. It darted, paused, then drifted again, like a shark testing the edge of a cage. Two sailors leaned closer, whispering. Probably a recon drone, one muttered, half sure, half hoping. The officer of the watch didn't answer. He stared at the trajectory line, knuckles whitening on the console. Then the ship's AI flickered a yellow prompt. Pattern anomaly detected. Reports indicate the SPY-6 can track hundreds of airborne contacts under ideal conditions. But the sea is never ideal. The Red Sea's hot air bends radar returns, turning birds into missiles and plastic debris into ghosts. Even with Aegis feeding predictive algorithms in real time, the system hesitated, unable to decide whether this dot was harmless clutter or something that wanted them dead. The radar operator adjusted a scan filter. The signal came back sharper, heavier. The frequency shift was small but deliberate. Whatever it wasn't a gull. The petty officer's hand trembled slightly over the console. Somewhere behind him, another sailor clicked a stopwatch out of habit. The countdown began in his head before it ever showed on screen. The officer of the watch could feel the hum of the ship through his boots, as if the hull itself were holding its breath. The AI's voice broke the silence, calm but lower now. Multiple echoes detected. Possible formation. The petty officer looked up. "Sir, more contacts. Same vector, same speed." The air thickened, like a storm building behind glass. Then the tone changed. Longer, deeper, mechanical. "Alert! Inbound tracks accelerating." The officer glanced at the wall clock. The second hand moved once, and his pulse followed it. His heart began to count with the ship. 3 minutes from now, those dots would decide everything. For a moment, the screen froze. Then half the contacts vanished. Just gone, wiped clean off the radar scope as if the ocean had swallowed them. The CIC fell silent, heads turning toward the operator. "System glitch?" someone asked. No one answered. 10 seconds later, the ghosts came back, but not where they were. They reappeared from 3 different directions, converging like a school of fish with a single mind. The operator's voice cracked. "Sir, I've got multiple re-entries, same signatures, new bearings." The officer of the watch felt his stomach tighten. Reports indicate swarm networks can exploit sensor saturation and electronic interference under favorable conditions. In plain English, they could blind the world's best radar just long enough to slip through. The SPY-6's range gate shimmered under electronic static, its once clear arcs now crawling with digital snow. On the overhead display, the ghosts multiplied. They blinked in and out, never in the same place twice. Aegis struggled to reconcile the data, spitting out probabilities that made no sense. 87%, 12%, 99%, all in the same breath. To the system, the sky was lying. To the sailors, the lie was closing in fast. "Action stations!" The command broke the trance. The deck shuddered as systems spun up, defense grids arming, countermeasures powering on. Sailors moved in controlled chaos, their drills turning fear into rhythm. They didn't need to see the enemy to know it was coming. The commanding officer gripped the rail above the tactical plot. He could feel the pulse of the ship under his hands, the rhythm of men and metal becoming one. The dots were lying, but the threat was real. He stared at the swarm forming from the edges of the radar, thinking only one thing. The next move had to be perfect, or it would be their last. The clock on the CIC wall blinked to life. Aero 3I in red digital numbers, pulsing like a heartbeat. Every sailor in the room knew what it meant. 3 minutes until impact. The tone that followed was sharp and mechanical, slicing through every whisper. On the tactical display, the swarm had stopped hiding. 40 airborne contacts, small, fast, and coming in low, lit up the radar like a storm of angry hornets. "Multiple inbound tracks confirmed," the AI intoned. The commanding officer's voice stayed steady, but his knuckles turned white. "Weapons free. Layered defense. SM-6 first. Reports indicate the SM-6 is often used for long-range interception in layered defense under appropriate engagement protocols. The first tubes armed, hydraulics hissing like serpents under pressure. At 180-120 seconds, the destroyer came alive. SPY-6's radar beam swept faster. ESSM batteries rotated, tracking in tight arcs. A petty officer muttered under his breath, 40 drones. That's 40. We can't hit them all. The operator next to him didn't look up. We don't need to. Just the right ones. At 120-60 seconds, the room's rhythm changed. The air vibrated with the pulse of electronics and adrenaline. Each second felt stretched thin, like a wire about to snap. The ship's AI tried to keep up, prioritizing threats by distance, speed, and angle. The radar pings came faster, 10, 15 per second, until it sounded like rain on metal. At 60-0, the first targets entered terminal range. On the screen, red blips flickered like fireflies, closing fast, breaking formation, diving. The officer of the watch felt the countdown burning behind his eyes. The moment stretched forever and vanished in the same breath. Fire. One word, calm and final. The missiles leapt free, carving white scars across the sky. The war had begun. The first missile fired at 02:59 on the clock. The deck thundered as the launcher caps flew open, smoke curling like claws around the steel. An SM-6 shot upward, its exhaust splitting the dawn, a silver spear cutting through the dark. The crew flinched from the blast wave. Heat rolled across the deck like a living thing. Reports indicate the SM-6, under ideal conditions, can engage high-value aerial targets at long ranges. Out here, ideal didn't exist. Only 3 minutes of chaos. The missile's motor screamed as it broke the cloud layer. In seconds, the radar marked its climb, one bright arc curving toward the swarm. The first intercept bloomed on screen, a burst of static and light. One drone vanished, then another. The watch team didn't cheer, they didn't have time. The second tube fired, then the third, and the horizon turned into a chain of fire. ESSM missiles joined next, smaller but faster, their trails weaving through the smoke. Each one caught a target mid-dive, detonating in flashes that turned the sky orange. The CIWS roared like a circular saw, tracing white arcs across the low horizon. To anyone watching from afar, It looked less like combat, and more like the sun had shattered into sparks. A gunner on deck 2 gripped his headset, breathing through the static. For a second, he thought of home, of his wife who hated the smell of gun oil, and then shoved the thought away. Aegis fed him new coordinates, and he fired again. The commanding officer whispered something under his breath. Maybe a prayer, maybe a curse. The CIC vibrated with noise, light, and heartbeat. Radar pings became percussion. The alarms became melody. The destroyer moved as one organism, striking, reloading, striking again. Above them, the sky was burning, and the first minute of war had just begun. At RO 1:15 on the clock, a warning flashed. Miss. One of the SM-6s had veered off course, drifting wide from its assigned target. On the main screen, the trajectory line bent away and disappeared into empty sky. No explosion, no flash, no kill confirmation. The Combat Information Center fell silent, as if the ship itself had stopped breathing. For a full second, no one spoke. Then someone whispered, "It missed." The commanding officer didn't answer. He simply stared at the range plot, jaw locked, pulse pounding behind his eyes. Every second bled away. 45 seconds to impact. The remaining swarm bore down, filling the screen with red. The noise returned, radar pings overlapping, AI alerts stacking, but it all sounded distant, hollow. One missile gone astray in a 3-minute war could mean hundreds of lives lost. Then something strange happened. The radar feed twitched. A cluster of UAV tracks, right at the swarm's center, blinked once and froze. The formation faltered, spacing collapsing like dominoes falling inward. A petty officer blinked. "Sir, half of them just stopped transmitting." Post-action data later suggested that the miss had not missed at all. Under favorable conditions, the intercept may have disrupted a command node, the signal relay that coordinated the swarm. It didn't explode, it blinded. And when the hive lost its eyes, it tore itself apart. On the tactical display, red contacts spiraled out of control, colliding mid-air, falling in pairs like burning leaves. The AI recalculated, remaining threats reduced by 50%. The tension in the room cracked open into a breathless relief. Someone exhaled hard, another laughed under their breath, almost afraid to believe it. The commanding officer allowed himself one nod, small, quiet, but full of weight. The miss had become the moment that saved them all. Smoke still lingered in the air like a fading scar. The CIC lights dimmed to normal levels, the roar of engines easing into a steady heartbeat. Sailors wiped sweat from their brows, their faces bathed in the green glow of the consoles. The worst seemed over, or so they thought. The commanding officer leaned over the tactical plot, recalibrating priorities. The AI compiled fresh data from every available source: radar, sonar, and high-altitude surveillance. Reports from the RC-135 Rivet Joint provided added ISR that, under favorable conditions, clarified swarm origins, likely from a coastal launch site beyond visual range. Operators worked in silence, rechecking every circuit and screen. SPY-6 shifted its radar focus, filtering out residual noise. The layered defense strategy was back in sync. SM-6 for long-range intercepts, ESSM for mid-range threats, CIWS for anything that slipped through. 3 layers, 3 chances to survive. The crew didn't need orders anymore. They moved like muscle memory. On deck, the smell of burnt propellant still hung thick. Damage control teams moved fast, scraping charred metal, resetting panels, running quick diagnostics. A gunner paused, wiping grime from his face, staring at the horizon, flat, blinding, and quiet. The sun climbed higher, reflecting off the water like a blade. For the first time in minutes, silence felt heavier than noise. Inside the CIC, the AI projected new threat models, clean, stable, organized. The commander finally exhaled, shoulders easing. For a fleeting heartbeat, it felt like control had returned. Then a tone broke the calm, low, guttural, alien. A red banner slashed across the main display. New contact detected. Supersonic trajectory. The room froze. Silence shattered into static. Somewhere beyond the radar's edge, another wave was already on its way. The sky they had just reclaimed was turning hostile again. The new contact came fast, too fast for another swarm. Its radar profile was jagged, inconsistent, like static pretending to be metal. Within seconds, the RC-135's data stream filled the CIC with fresh imagery. Under favorable conditions, the aircraft's sensors can triangulate electromagnetic sources far beyond surface range. What it found wasn't a missile. It was a relay, a floating node, or maybe a disguised vessel, broadcasting encrypted control packets into the battle space. The revelation hit harder than any explosion. This wasn't a rogue strike. It was coordinated, methodical, an extension of a larger campaign. The swarm had been nothing more than a puppet, and somewhere beyond the horizon, the puppet master was pulling strings through a proxy network. The crew traded glances, anger, disbelief, and a growing realization that the real enemy wasn't on radar at all. The commanding officer adjusted his tone, voice clipped and focused. "Shift priority. Disrupt the relay." Orders rippled across the CIC. Under favorable conditions, SIGINT analysis can locate and exploit such nodes by isolating transmission frequencies. Aegis rerouted resources, recalibrating sensors to hunt the hidden signal source. No one knew if it would work, but the idea of striking back steadied their hands. Minutes later, the relay's signal stuttered. Its packet rhythm broke apart, then went dark. The remaining UAVs lost cohesion, spiraling into the sea like burning shrapnel. The CIC erupted in cautious cheers, half relief, half disbelief. The commander didn't smile. He knew what the data meant. They'd won the engagement, not the war. Outside, the Red Sea shimmered with the wreckage of drones and dreams alike. Somewhere beyond range, another relay might already be waiting. The battle ended the way storms do, without warning, only silence. The decks were covered in a fine layer of gray dust, part ash, part salt. The air smelled of scorched metal and ozone. Ventilation fans hummed, pushing out the last traces of smoke. Crews moved with tired precision, checking systems, wiping soot from panels, resetting safeties. No one spoke loudly. The ocean around them had gone eerily calm, as if the sea itself was catching its breath. The commanding officer stood by the CIC display, arms crossed, watching the last red contact fade from the map. In the quiet glow, his reflection looked older, heavier. He thought of something his former captain once told him. The hardest part of command isn't the fight. It's the silence after. The words fit perfectly now. He looked out through the armored glass, the horizon stretching endless and pale. High above, a P-8 Poseidon orbited lazily, its sensors sweeping the water below. Reports indicate the P-8 can provide maritime patrol and ISR under appropriate mission profiles, and today its role was simply to watch, to confirm that the sky and the sea were finally clear. The pilot inside exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders loosening for the first time in hours. Down below, the destroyer drifted steady, its engines low, its crew quiet. The countdown had ended. 180 seconds, just 3 minutes, but enough to change the course of hundreds of lives. The Red Sea shimmered in the distance, peaceful again, but no one aboard would ever call it calm. 3 minutes. That was all it took. Not for heroics, not for miracles, but for every sensor, every mind, and every ounce of training to align at once. The victory didn't belong to luck. It belonged to coordination, to systems that spoke the same language, and to people who didn't freeze when the clock began to count down. The destroyer had survived not because it was invincible, but because it listened to its sensors, to its crew, to the sea itself. On the command deck, the radar ping slowed, each pulse now a heartbeat instead of an alarm. The CIC returned to a dim red calm, monitors flickering like tired eyes. Someone finally poured a cup of coffee, the first since the battle began. It trembled in the sailor's hand, then slipped, shattering softly on the steel floor. No one flinched. The sound felt ordinary again. Outside, the horizon glowed gold. The Red Sea stretched quiet, littered with wreckage that caught the morning light like tiny mirrors. The battle was over, but the war, the kind fought in signals, algorithms, and invisible hands, was only beginning. Reports indicate that future swarms and warfare by proxy systems could become more adaptive, more deceptive, and more autonomous under favorable conditions. The Navy would call this a victory. Historians might call it a warning. In the end, it was just 3 minutes and a lesson, one written in smoke, silence, and the calm that follows chaos. If this story pulled you in, don't let it end here. Like, share, and subscribe, so every scenario can stretch beyond imagination and linger long after the screen fades. Remember, this is storytelling, not a playbook. No commander, sailor, or soldier should ever gamble with lives in reckless games of intimidation. The purpose is to illustrate, to dramatize, to warn, never to instruct. Any resemblance to classified missions or individuals is purely coincidental. The intent is not to mislead or glorify war, but to spark curiosity, reflection, and a deeper appreciation for how fragile modern conflict can be.